Welcome to How to Make Good Things Happen. I'm really delighted to have Tim Leunig, our chief economist here at Nesta, to talk about furlough today. As you'll hear, furlough, I didn't quite appreciate it until I saw Tim's slides, just quite how quickly this was conceived. I can't think of any other policy that was as big and as radical and as fast. So I'll be personally fascinated to hear more about what this was, how it happened, but also what we can learn more generally in terms of policy making and implementation. So thank you very much for joining us here. What we're going to do is hear from Tim for about 10 minutes. I'll ask a few follow-up questions and then we'll throw it open to questions and comments from you. Over to Tim. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. Welcome introduction. We've done that, haven't we? There we are. Right. That's the title. You all know that's the title because you signed up. If that's not the lecture you think you're here for, you're welcome to leave at this moment. And when I do that at the first lecture of term at LSE, there's always some student who stares in and scuttles out, realizing they're in the wrong room. But you all appear to be in the right room. So that's me. That's usually just the holding slide I put up at the beginning. So we can skip over that one as well. So let me take you back almost 5 years. Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister. Keir Starmer's not yet leader of the Labour Party, very close, but not quite. And this is the 16th of March, the Monday, and he's urging people to stay at home, but he's not telling them. There's no command. We haven't shut anything down. It's this odd thing of, please don't go to the shops, but they're still open. Please don't go to the pub, but they're still open. That's where we are on Monday. But it's getting rapidly worse. And when I say rapidly, by Wednesday, we're announcing that we're closing schools. Now, I don't know how many of you have kids, but closing schools, think back to when you were kids. Did the government ever close schools? I mean, never, right? Occasionally bad weather closes schools, but not the government. So at this point, we know it's basically all over. We're going to shut down the economy. And I get a phone call from the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. I'm his economic advisor at the time, and unfortunately, I missed the phone call. Now, he didn't ring me often. I think this was one of only 2 phone calls he made to me. We were both good people, and we tried to go through private office at all times. I was a civil servant, everything on paper. But there are times when you just ring someone, and he just rang me. And at 9:26, I wasn't in the office. I was cycling to the station because I'm not an early riser. Thanks for arranging this one so early, mate. So I noticed that I'd missed the call, and I texted him back, you rang me. On my way to the office now, he types rather embarrassedly. And he replies, please, Rishi was always terribly courteous, right? We're in the middle of a crisis, and he still types at least half the word please. Please can you work with Douglas and Michael, special advisors, both economists, on this employment support program. We didn't have an employment support program at this point, but we knew we needed one. And then this gloriously understated need to work at pace. No shit, Sherlock. But as I say, Rishi was always a courteous sort of person. Thanks. And I typed, of course, omitting the space, not realizing that I would screenshot this later. And what followed, I'm then at Wimbledon Station. And I think about this, and I think, oh, the answer's obvious. It's furlough. Because over the previous few years, 6 months, something like that, I'd been looking at furlough schemes around the world. We had the German embassy in to explain to us why their employment rates were higher than ours. And they said, oh, we don't know, particularly among the over 50s. And I said, well, tell me something about German labour markets and law that we don't do in Britain and you think we should know about. And they explained the furlough system that's existed for 30-odd years in Germany. And then I went to the US in the January just before furlough to teach at a university. And I discovered that every single person on the admin side of the university is furloughed every summer unpaid. And I talk to these people and say, isn't this terrible? And they're like, no, we love it. We're almost all women in their 30s wanting to do proper skilled jobs and wanting the summer off to look after our kids. I discovered in the US there are some people who are furloughed for 45 weeks of the year. They work the 7 weeks before Christmas in a shop in the rush period. And because it's a permanent job, they can put it on the mortgage and they know they've got it next year. So I'd been thinking furloughs of different types are interesting. I said, you know what, mate? You've asked me a question I know the answer to. And I spent from Wimbledon to Vauxhall 11 minutes thinking it through, and another 9 minutes cycling from Vauxhall to the Treasury. And I went to see Douglas and Michael and discovered there was no employment support program. And they said, yeah, that's a good idea. And then I went to see seniors, Claire Lombardelli, Beth Russell, etc. They thought it was a good idea, and we pitched it to the Chancellor at 12 o'clock. So that is the most useful 2 hours and 34 minutes of my life. And Rishi asked a whole lot of decent questions, and at 1 o'clock, he decided to go for it, subject to HMRC saying that they could administer it. And they were given the rest of the day to veto the plan. If they knew they couldn't administer it, they had to veto it. Otherwise, it was game on. And then we spent 2 days. I wasn't aware there was a camera. As you can see, I always wear the same jumper. In fact, I'm wearing the same shirt as well. There we are. The jumper, I could have promised you, the shirt is just the one that's on the left of the rack. And there is me chewing my thumb as I do when I'm thoughtful, sitting next to Claire Lombardelli, completely oblivious to the Treasury photographer. And then we get these very anodyne announcements on the government website. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, in case you didn't know who the Chancellor was, I want to know who reads a government press release and needs to be told who the Chancellor is, provides an updated statement on coronavirus. And this is what he said. He's looking a little bit tired there. He's working, I think, 17-hour days at this point, which he did for months on end. If any of you are tempted to go into politics, just try working 17 hours for a couple of weeks and see if you're in a fit state to do anything at the end. If you are, you have it made. If you're not, think about another career. It's really helpful in a top politician to be able to get by with very little sleep. And here he talked about the biggest, something that is unprecedented, his sense of the responsibility that if the government closes the economy, the government must protect people who are essentially forced out of work by government diktat. And thus he said, we're setting up a new corona job retention scheme. Because at the last minute we said, can we come up with a better name? And we were all so exhausted. The answer was, no, we couldn't. In Australia, they called it Job Keeper. That was a much better name. No other detail of the Australian scheme was better than ours, but they had a better name. Comparative advantage. And then, I don't know why I'm doing it that way. It's always going to look at it that way. 1 week later, there is the Prime Minister again, telling us that it is now an instruction to stay at home. It is no longer an urging, it is an instruction. Stay at home. We will immediately close absolutely everything you can think about. And that's when lockdown starts. But it starts after we've announced the furlough scheme. And since then, I've been hugged by random people who told me that they felt that they were safe, that they weren't going to lose their house, they weren't going to get behind on their mortgage. I don't particularly welcome being hugged by random middle-aged people. The first couple were nice. It's gone on a little longer. So here are 3 things I want to say before I hand over to Ravi to ask me questions. Did it work? Well, 9 million people, the BBC predicted, would be furloughed, and they were pretty much spot on. That doesn't mean 9 million people would have lost their jobs. There is obviously what we in economics call dead weight. Our best guess is 3.25 million people would have been made redundant, not had their contracts renewed or similar. And our best guess comes from looking at the United States. At the top of this graph, you've got a bunch of other countries, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, all of which had furlough schemes. And you've got their employment figures. They go down a bit, they go up again. And then you've got the United States. The United States did not have a furlough scheme. And pro rata, that would have been 3.25 million people losing their jobs in Britain. And that's exactly what economists predicted. If you shut down the economy, we predict 3.25 million people losing their jobs. So it was a useful morning of my life, a useful morning for all of us in the Treasury. It was incredibly rewarding to work on something where you can see really good evidence that you've saved 3 million people's jobs. One good thing about furlough was it was essentially self-limiting. When we opened the economy, people went back to work automatically because they had to. If the boss says, we're opening again, you come back into work, you either come back into work or you resign and lose your job. And virtually nobody resigned at that moment. A few would write in and say, hey, I'm shielding, can I be on sick leave? But not many. And that's why you get these really big step downs in the number of people who are on furlough, because when we reopen part of the economy, shops reopen, pubs reopen, people go back to work. And it ended with a whimper and not a bang. There were still people furloughed at the end, but when we shut it down, there was no big round of redundancies. So that's a good thing. But it wasn't perfect. Here was a very unlucky couple who both got jobs right just before we shut down the economy, and unfortunately, neither their employers had told HMRC that they were employed. And a condition of furlough was your employer had to have told HMRC that you were on the books and have paid some tax on you before we announced furlough. Because otherwise, everyone could just announce that they'd employed their partner at 50,000 quid a year and they'd now like to furlough them in a non-existent job. And this couple were both very unlucky. I think they're the only couple the media found where it had happened to both of them. And there is no doubt that that couple are slam dunk unlucky. So it wasn't perfect. They were the excluded and so on. And there were big campaigns for them, but we could come up with no way that didn't just open the floodgates to fraud. I want to say something about the conditions that make this work, and it's about knowledge. Why didn't the US do this? Because they couldn't. They couldn't, because the US has no idea who's employed at any one time. They do not have PAYE. They don't have any sense of who's employed until the end of the tax year, just as we don't for the self-employed. So we couldn't come up with a good scheme for the self-employed. We had a scheme, but it gave far too much money to some self-employed people and not enough to others compared with furlough. But we had to do something for moral justice, etc. But it wasn't a good scheme in the same way. Conversely, however, there's a whole bunch of things we don't know in Britain. We don't know how many people are here. We don't know how many households there are. We don't know where they live. We don't know what sectors they work in. We don't know how many hours they do. So there's a bunch of other things. People kept saying, you should limit furlough to affected sectors. I'm like, I don't know which sectors people work in. I know the name of the company, but very often it's a holding company. You work for Manpower, and they've subcontracted you to someone else. We don't know who you've been subcontracted to. You could work for a very large organisation. Some bits are in catering and some bits aren't. We have no idea what people are doing in Britain. And hence my final line, red tape equals data. Next time you see someone opposing red tape, ask yourself, what data are they opposing? And are those data worth having? I think there's also a question for the British state as to our state of knowledge. Why is it that I seem to be the only person in Britain who'd heard of furlough? And only then pretty randomly because the German embassy had told me about it and I'd been in America. I'd managed to do 3 degrees in economics, including labour markets, taught by Steve Nichol, right? Steve Nichol's a very fine economist. He knows a lot about labour markets. Did he ever teach us that almost every country, every single dot, you don't need to read those names. You just need to see there's a lot of dots in that first column. And that first column is countries that already had furlough. Germany has a furlough scheme. They use it when industries are in trouble. They use it to try and keep workers matched to firms, to keep those firm-specific skills alive. Why is it we don't know that stuff? Why is it that most government departments don't have an international unit whose job it is to study the rest of the world? If there is one meta lesson I would take from this, it is that we in Britain should stop being so insular. You don't even have to speak foreign languages now. Use translation. Get AI to summarize you. Just ask it. How does France manage its labour markets and so on and so forth? Because it's always better to copy people's ideas than to try and invent them. Right, I was told I had no more than 10 minutes.
Great, thank you very much. Tim, first of all, you sort of said that HMRC had half a day to then work out what was implementable.
Heroes.
That feels, because in some ways you can always argue that coming up with the policy idea is easier in some ways than figuring out, well, how the hell do I get this to work? Can you just give us a sense of what was the complexity in implementation? What were they grappling with? How did that work in the end? One of the things I'm most proud of is, I think I'm allowed to say this even on the record, is that at the end of it all, I nominated the 2 most senior people in HMRC for honours. Because actually the Treasury got so much good publicity for what we did. Loads of people talk about me as the person who invented furlough, whereas all I did was steal it. But they were the people who actually did it. And the things they had to do is work out how to make their systems work. Because HMRC is an organisation that takes money from you. It doesn't give you money very often. If you overpay your taxes, it'll give you a refund, at least sometimes. It prefers just to reduce the amount it takes next year. But it's not used to giving out money, particularly to companies. So one of the things they had to do was literally discover, could they find companies' bank accounts? Because when companies pay HMRC, HMRC doesn't know the company's bank account. So could they even reliably reimburse Toyota and IKEA? So it was thinking through really practical questions like that, because you don't want to send all the money you're going to give to IKEA to some Russian who has managed to spoof that they're IKEA. And it was questions like that that they had to answer very quickly. And the second thing they had to answer was, could they do any sort of fraud check? And that's why they said to us, the one thing you must do,
From memory, we had to delay the announcement 1 day or something because it was after one of the deadlines for HMRC data coming in. But they said if you leave it another week, no more people will be covered, because if you go beyond that, the fraud risk will be huge. So on the first day, they just told Rishi and the team that they were confident they could do it, and then they got 48 hours to come up with an action plan showing how they would do it and say when it could open. And they did it amazingly well. Again, I think I'm allowed to say this. One major national newspaper, a broadsheet, one of the better broadsheets, the sort of broadsheet you would expect me to read, reserved a quarter of the front page for furlough IT fiasco. Because this is a brand new government project, something we've never done before, something we're delivering at pace, and something involving IT. The newspaper had a slam dunk front page story. But it didn't. There was no IT fiasco because HMRC got it right. They provided, from memory, 4 ways for companies to tell them. They spoke to all the providers of PAYE software because 6 in 7 firms and something like 9 out of 10 people are employed by companies that use one of the big payroll softwares. And all of those companies stepped up and delivered an add-on that did it automatically. So there was no IT fiasco. They had to go inside the newspaper. They looked on Twitter. They rang all their contacts. Absolutely nobody had failed. We had 600 people from memory in HMRC ready to answer the phones for furlough to explain to companies what to do. Most of them never picked up the phone. They just did their day jobs. They weren't sitting around, I hasten to add. They just got on with their day jobs because so few people rang the hotline because it worked so well. And HMRC were absolute slam dunk heroes. And that is not something people say on the record very often. So let me repeat it. HMRC were slam dunk heroes, and we should all celebrate the work they did, both the strategic work initially and then the behind the scenes grunt work of dealing particularly with small employers.
And if you went to them now with another sort of scheme, without the kind of crisis of COVID, do you think you'd get the same kind of response?
No.
And so how do we get a more responsive answer when we typically come up with an idea that involves IT?
So first of all, I would hope not to get the same level of response because it isn't sensible to try and do things in a week in general. You are taking risks. Nor would I expect my staff to be working 12 hours a day on a Saturday, 12 hours a day on a Sunday, and so on. That's not a reasonable way to operate in peacetime. I think what was distinctive about this was the willingness not to have one size fits all. So almost everybody went through their payroll software, but for small firms of up to 10 employees, they were allowed to just type the national insurance numbers in a box. And then HMRC would manually do it. I think we even had an ability for them to fax it in if necessary, if they had no more than 5 employees, because we were so determined that no company would feel excluded. And we thought there's bound to be somebody with a fax machine. I'm not sure anybody did fax it in, but we were willing to be that kind to companies and say there are lots of different ways. And perhaps we should be more generous to companies in saying, and to individuals in saying, let's make it work for you, and you may be a bit old-fashioned. The other thing was, of course, companies we expected it to be a one-shot game. So we were willing to have some very manual things, so we only have to deal with it once.
Okay. So I'm trying to think what's the counterfactual. What would have happened if you hadn't have taken Rishi's call? And I guess one option is that people do lose their jobs, but they're paid a much, much higher benefit level instead. And is that sort of what happened in the States? And let me say, the reason I'm interested in this is that because you could argue that furlough was a bad thing.
You could.
So some people would say, look, what has distinguished America in the last 5 years is an incredible productivity boom, and the labour market turnover that has been created by that sort of shock has been good. It's allocated labour to where it's best utilised, and actually, despite the kind of narrative that we live in a more precarious world, the UK has not had very high labour market turnover in recent years. So could you argue that the sort of, look, yes, they're all going to lose their jobs, they're going to get paid exactly the same, but then they're going to have to be re-employed. Could that have been a better option?
Categorically not. Britain has had a terrible employment trajectory since COVID, but if you look at this graph, all those others with COVID, which you can also see down there, all those others who had furlough schemes are all above the United States. It just isn't true that throwing the equivalent of 3 million people out of work somehow gives you a good labour market outcome, because some people exit the labour market altogether at that point. I remember an interview with a woman who'd been made redundant at Topshop. just before COVID, I think it was. Topshop had gone bankrupt, and she said, I've worked here for 32 years. What am I going to do now? She said, I literally don't know how to get a job. My mum worked in Topshop, and that's how I got this one. And again, you're in your 50s. My mum lost her job in her 50s. She applied for more than 100 other jobs in retail and cleaning, jobs she had done in her life, jobs she could do in her sleep and perfectly well. My mum was a hard worker. You want to know why I'm a hard worker? It's because I was brought up that way. She applied for 100 jobs. She got 1 interview and 1 rejection letter. And then she gave up. And she got an allotment and made herself food to survive. So I think it would have been incredibly risky. And actually, the US employment figures suggest that it was incredibly risky. The other thing about the British furlough scheme, which was globally unique and which I'm proud of because I was worried about that as well, is under the British furlough scheme, you could change jobs without permission of your employer, and you've still got the furlough money. So it was the best time ever to change jobs. And actually, surprisingly few people did. And we wanted people to be able to go and work for Tesco and Sainsbury's as van drivers delivering shopping. The thing we feared most was we'd have 3 million people sitting at home and a bunch of new jobs that needed to be done. And these people would say, no way am I doing that job. It's less well paid, it's less secure. So we were the only people in the world. And the OECD are currently investigating whether that worked, whether we needed to publicise it more. The person I know who was most successful on that was a young man called Tom, who won MasterChef. And he worked in Nando's as a waiter. They have some fancy name for that in Nando's, and he'd always wanted to be a chef. And he was furloughed, and he trained using YouTube in becoming a chef, and he won MasterChef, and he now has his own restaurant. And he gave a lovely interview, and he said, I owe it all to furlough. And I wanted to get him in to speak to the Treasury, but their Treasury weren't keen on that because they thought we'd have to pay him, and then we'd have to go out to contract and decide whether he was the best person. It's not fun always working in government. And that was a real business as usual moment when red tape got in the way. I thought, I'm sure the guy will just record a video to be played to us saying thank you. I never got it.
Just to push on this point, one more though, because
Yeah,
I think you can definitely argue that it's been much, much worse for all the people in America who've been out of work. But can you argue that from a productivity perspective, the American approach was better? Or do you think that argument that the sort of reallocation of labour is overdone as a kind of cause of improved productivity?
So I'm a huge believer in the reallocation of labour. I think job durations are generally too long. There are all sorts of reasons why I think we should make labour markets more fluid. You've just hired someone to be my boss. We've had to wait 3 months for this guy to arrive. In the US, we'd only have to wait a couple of weeks. There are many things we can do to make labour markets more fluid. And we know that a big chunk of productivity gains come from people moving employer. So I'm all in favour of that. But when I compare the US and Germany or the US and France, I just don't see a lot of evidence that furlough is an anti-productivity story. But I definitely think we should study the US for productivity, always.
Now, furlough is a one-off. Should we be having a furlough scheme in perpetuity,
Yes,
like the other countries that you cited here? And what were the use cases for furlough being used now?
So the case that the German embassy gave me was about the problems of chip supply in the car industry. You may remember that at one point we were short of chips, car firms couldn't produce cars, car prices shot up. My second-hand car went up in value, according to WeBuyAnyCar.com, 10 times. One year it was worth £58, the next year it was worth £580. I think that makes it a classic. In Germany, the car manufacturers came together and they vote at the level of the sector to say, we have a supply problem. And if 2/3 of them vote for it, they can go to the government and say, we want furlough. And from memory, the workers have to take a week of unpaid leave or a week of holiday leave. The company has to pay the next week 100%. So for the company, it's not trivial to say we're declaring furlough. You annoy your workers and you have to pay a chunk yourself. And then there's a 3-way split between the employee takes a pay cut, like in furlough, which is related to family size in Germany because they have a whole bunch of different data that we don't have. The company pays part of it, the government pays part of it. And that means that if you buy a BMW next year, it has been built by someone who is on a very long-term contract to BMW, who owes a debt of loyalty to BMW. Whereas in Britain, the way we manage these swings is we have a lot of contract staff, and they get laid off very, very quickly when there's a downturn. A friend of mine works for McLaren. He assembles cars. He's just been laid off for 3 weeks, no income. You've got to wonder, he's young, he's really keen to work for McLaren. He will still He will still build those McLarens perfectly. But you've got to wonder in the long run about the commitment of people building cars in Britain to the company when so many of them can and are laid off quickly.
Okay.
So yeah, I think a furlough scheme is something that's worth considering, but it should never be extensive. In the great financial crisis, Germany had furloughed 4 or 5% of their employees. You never want to be going above that. It would cost far too much.
Okay. I'm going to ask one more question. I've got some more that I could ask, but let me ask one more and then we'll go to the audience. You had a slide up there which said knowledge is power.
Yep.
And you suggested that there's lots of other things we don't know, whether that's about the labour market, or lots of other things. And obviously with the combination of data and AI, the potential to extend our state capacity in terms of its knowledge could be huge in the next 5 years. What would be your, your top 10 or top 5 things that the state should know but doesn't?
So I'll give you the one thing that we do now know that I got us to know. We have something called the National Pupil Database in Britain. If you're under 40, you're in it. You're in it whether you went to a state school or a private school. And it records every single qualification you got. Literally, it records your Key Stage 1 score. If you're the right age, it has your early years foundation profile score. It also has whether you're on free school meals, whether you have English as additional language, your postcode, the postcode of your school, the Ofsted rating of your school, a whole bunch of stuff. And I got that linked to income tax data when I was in government, so that we could work out what forms of education work and whether qualifications are enough to overcome disadvantage or whether disadvantages persist over and above qualifications. We've now added in the company you work for. We've linked it to that database as well. So we'll know, for example, how many people with qualification X are directly using that because they're working for a sector. So I'm really proud of that, and that's really pushed forward. What I would love to do next is add health data. Because at that level of anonymity, in this data set, it records all sorts of stuff about you, whether you were poor, whether you were adopted, all sorts of things. This is proper confidential data. It has never been misused. It's never been used to find a child in some bad way. But it has led to huge understanding that helps those children, and I would like to see the same in health. And I'd like to see the same particularly for maternal health. How bad is it if one of your parents, and particularly your mother, has bad health, particularly bad mental health, in terms of your outcomes? That could be huge in terms of where do we direct resources. Which are the sorts of health problems actually knock you out? We're talking all sorts of stuff about sickness. We just keep talking about sickness and sickness benefit, because we have no idea really which sicknesses, either in future or now, cause you to drop out of the labour market, or will do in future. So that would be my number one, absolutely. My number 2 is working hours. Women are ever more interesting to labour market economists. I'm an economic historian. 300 years ago, women were, in productivity terms, on average 0.6 of a man. It's in the book of Leviticus, and it's been true from then until the dawn of power, because women are on average less strong than men. They're less good at ploughing fields manually. So men were the most part of the economy, and back in a pre-contraception era, women were mainly looking after children. We now have fewer children, and the big determinant of your contribution to GDP is how well you do in school and university. And women are just acing it in a way that boys are not. So women should be the majority of GDP. But we see in the data, we know how much women earn in total, and a lot of them in their 30s suddenly halve their salary. We can be pretty sure they've had a kid and gone half-time. But then they go up 10%. Are they working more hours or are they getting promoted? Because those are really different things in terms of understanding the labour market. So here's my COD statistic for you. Italy could match Sweden in terms of female labour market participation. Italian GDP per head would rise 20%. Now that's as close as you're going to get to a silver bullet in economics. Britain can't do that, but Britain has one of the biggest male-female wage differentials in the world on yearly earnings. So decomposing that to know, is it about hours? Is it about lack of promotion, particularly for graduate women with children? There's such a potentially big gain to the economy. I would love it. And I think the Treasury is about to do this. I pushed very hard for it when I was in government, that employers will have to give either the actual number of hours or the percentage of FTE. And again, not making the perfect the enemy of the good, right? Most firms can do either actual hours or percentage FTE. You should know one or the other, right?
The other addition that I think others in Nesta have historically suggested is that when it comes to understanding people's transitions through the labour market, we don't really know how people make their way because we don't collect sort of occupational data within the tax system. And we should be able to see what's the weird and wonderful way in which people progress.
So I think we'll be close to doing that with the new Leo database that matches skills to earnings, and now we're adding in employer.
Right.
So I think we'll very soon be able to do that. And for example, that will tell us whether working in McDonald's as your first job is better or worse for your long-term trajectory than working in Tesco. I mean, literally, you've got a kid who's 16, who hates school, who just needs to get a job. Where do you tell them to go and work? My standard advice is go and work for a large firm, not a small firm, because large firms usually have more internal. But yeah, am I right? I don't know. All I can say is if you go and work for a fish and chip shop, you can't go up internally. If you go and work for McDonald's, you can. But I don't actually know whether that's good advice or bad, and I would love to know it.
Okay, great. Let's pause there and just get some comments or questions here. Great, we've got loads. Let's go to the front row, first two there. Yeah. Yep.
Hi, Heather Stewart from The Guardian. I'm interested in what the conversation... Hello, sorry, quite a loud voice anyway, I'm sure it's fine.
It's being recorded though, so...
Oh, fine. So Heather Stewart from The Guardian. I'm interested in what the conversation was on that very rushed day about the impact of this scheme on the public finances. What would be the cost of it? What would be the duration of it? What would be the long-term impact? Because in some ways we're still looking at the long-term impact of it on public finances, right? And I know that there were various points where Rishi Sunak quite wanted to switch the scheme off, but people weren't ready to go back to work, and it got extended and extended. I just wonder whether was that part of the conversation, or was it it's such an emergency that the sense was we're just going to have to do this whatever it costs?
So there were obviously costs about public finance, right? The Treasury does not spend money. We hadn't found the magic money tree. So the Chancellor asked us what our best guess was, and we came up with an estimate of the cost per person per month, which turned out, again, heroic assumptions, because far more minimum wage employees were furloughed than we'd expected. We were confident skilled people would be, people who have skills that are specific for the firm. And actually, we talked to a lot of restaurants afterwards, and they said the reason we furloughed people rather than letting them go was we knew they worked well as a team, so that when we wanted to reopen, we could resummon these 6 people. They all knew their role in the kitchen. They knew how these fancy tills worked. So far more minimum wage staff were furloughed than we expected. And that was a good thing, because actually those are the people you really want to keep in touch with the labour market, because they can drop out very easily. So we gave him a cost per million people per month. We then said there were lots of numbers around at the sort of 9 million mark, so we weren't too far out on that. And then we said, well, how long is it going to last? Well, it depends how long COVID lasts. We said, we're economists. We have absolutely no idea.
So it's quite open-ended, even at that?
Yeah, so initially we announced it for 3 months. We were confident it would have to run for 6 months. We did not expect it to run for nearly that long. But one of the things about furlough, I mean, if you look at this, the number of jobs that were furloughed, is the costs were very much front-ended. It began to decline pretty quickly, and if we hadn't have got the second wave, we probably would have ended it much more quickly. It would have cost less than from memory, 77 billion that it cost. And yeah, I hope I never get to spend 77 billion again. I mean, it's not something you aspire to, right? You hope there'll never be a crisis. You hope there'll be lots of economic growth, and then you get good public finances. And we do. I mean, we do need to repair public finances. Debt in Britain is very high. And that means even a small interest rate movement, as we've seen in the last couple of months, is really worrying for a government. I mean, they've come back down now, but that little worry, yeah, your question's real and good.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Haskell, Imperial College, and I was on the Bank of England over this time. Tim, thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. But a follow-up to Heather's question, actually. On that graph there, something that we at the bank worried about enormously is right at the very end of furlough, there were still 1 million workers on furlough. So I can ask a long question, but let me try a short question, is should we regard that as a good part of the scheme or a bad part of the scheme? As I recall, 300,000 of those workers had been on, as it were, long-term furlough all the time. And I'm not quite sure, as I say, whether that's a good or a bad sign. But thank you, Tim. Very interesting lecture. Thank you.
So in the longer version of this talk, I do this by size of firm. And what you find is at the end, they're almost all in small firms. And a lot of them, bluntly, are what I would call favour furloughs. So a friend of mine is self-employed, and he employs his wife to make him cups of tea. So just in case you're around, he says, oh, will you make me a cup of tea? She said, oh, it's your turn. He said, no, you're paid. But it's a joke between them. And basically, he employs her in order to minimise the household tax, because she wouldn't otherwise be working. He pays her 12,000 quid a year, she gets a national insurance record, that's 12,000 quid that is not taxed at 40%. I bet he furloughed her. And I bet he furloughed her for the entire duration. And that was completely legal. I'm not suggesting he did anything illegal. So that's one group. And of course, they ended at the end, those people didn't become unemployed. The second group were, we got wind of small firms who had, say, 4 or 5 employees, one of whom was older. And that person was just scared to come back to work. And so they were furloughed right the way throughout, because it's pretty hard to say to the person who's worked for you for 30 years. So let's say my mum was still in work for someone she'd worked for 30 years. She didn't have great health towards the end. I could imagine her boss would have furloughed her right the way throughout. And again, is that good or bad? Well, that's more ambiguous, right? You could say, well, if you worked for IKEA, you'd have now had to make the choice of coming back or resigning, and most people did come back, and they kind of got over their fear. So I think there's a bunch of favour furloughs at the end. There's also a few people who would have otherwise retired, who again work for a small firm for a family friend, who are furloughed throughout, because why wouldn't you? And if the person's on minimum wage, even when the company has to pay 20%, you might do it to help staff morale and the others. Look how well I looked after this person who was scared to come back to work. And that engenders a sense of niceness in the company. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of things going on. But if you were harder, I think you would use the use of furlough by big firms to decide when to close it down.
Do we have any sense of sort of labour market scarring effects from furlough? For instance, are today's inactivity...
I really want to do a study on this, and I've been talking to Paul Johnson at the IFS to see if we should go into partnership on this. I think we can use retail workers. So IKEA workers were furloughed, Topshop workers, Topshop went bankrupt just before, were made redundant, and Tesco workers worked right the way through. It seems to me that's as close as you will get to a randomised controlled trial of staying in work, being furloughed, essentially the American system of losing your job. I think that's as good as we're going to get. So if there are any funders in the audience who wish to fund Paul Johnson and I to do this, please get in touch. You can find both of us on LinkedIn.
Okay, we'll carry on this table and then we'll diversify geographically.
Thank you. George Eliot, Association of MBAs. Follow up on favor furloughs. Can we glean any data about the Anglo-Saxon model of capitalism by comparing good leavers and bad leavers? Because there were a lot of people who, in different sense, favor furloughs, but who went back to their employer while they were serving their notice period and said, can you please keep me? As opposed to, is it typical of the economy that people move on and never come back?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Initially, there were a whole bunch of people who were made redundant, who were then unmade redundant and furloughed. And we in government were very keen on that at the time, because the whole point was to get people not to move around the country. So I remember there was, Chris Giles wrote an article in the FT criticising a language school that had just gone bankrupt in Cambridge. It had made everyone redundant. We announced furlough the next day. It unredundant to them and furloughed them. And we said, no, we want that to happen because we don't want all these people to suddenly lose their rent in Cambridge, migrate across the country, go back to live with their parents and spread COVID. We want people to stay in their current home. So in the short run, we were keen on that sort of stuff. In the medium term, you've asked a good question. Email it to me. And we'll have a think about that one, because that's a good one.
Okay, great.
He's my former student. Former students ask good questions.
Let's
They're
go
well
to
trained.
this side, gentleman there. Yeah.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I'm Omar from TESO. I'm quite interested also in the interaction of policies, right, that otherwise don't look like they have interactions. So my sense was that you couldn't close the economy down until you sorted things like childcare and you sorted things like furlough, right? And so what it exposed is we had other social policy areas that need fixing first. And in the US, I suspect that the fact that health insurance is tied to employment constrained policymakers' choices. So I'm kind of curious both about any thoughts or observations about the interactions of different social policy areas that don't look like they interact, but then prevent or constrain, but also incentivize policymakers to make certain decisions. But secondly, unemployment insurance is another thing that I've heard is weaker, that data suggests is worse in the UK. And so I suppose the thought there is if we were to expand a furlough scheme permanently, would it be sensible to try to think about how we interact that with improved unemployment insurance to sort of deal with some of these favor furloughs that you're talking about?
So first of all, the evidence in the US is they didn't care that much that there was no good unemployment benefit. They just went ahead and said, you're just going to have to deal with it. One of the issues we had in Britain is that universal credit is not designed to have 3.5 million people claim it for the first time in a week. And possibly far more people increase their claims if they got reduced hours. So we were genuinely worried about universal credit falling over. And at that point, you'd have two choices. You'd either have to tell people, well, we'll get to your claim in 6 weeks' time or something when we've got through the backlog. And literally, you'd have a limit to the number of people who could claim a day. And you could imagine that being a real disaster. Or you'd have to play every claim exactly without any checks, at which point the fraud levels from Russians and the like would be large. So yeah, there were real problems. And you're right that we did try and think about them. But actually in a crisis, you sometimes just work within silos and you trust the next silo is working. Because once you try and do things across government, it slows down. That's why when people say the British government is far too siloed, it's not. Sometimes it needs to be even more siloed, because only when you've got a small team with a clear aim they're going to hit will you get anything done.
Okay, great. Who else wants to come in with questions? There and then there.
Were there any, other than sacking loads of people, were there any credible alternatives considered either in the UK or elsewhere?
At 11:30 that morning on your train journey.
Well, I didn't consider any because I'd already done furlough. And I don't know if you've ever taken the train from Wimbledon to Vauxhall, but it's not very far. I mean, it's 2 zones, right? There's a limit to how much thinking you can do in that time. There was talk about whether unemployment benefits should be changed so that it related to your previous income. And in answer to your question, most economists think it would be better to have a period of unemployment benefit that is related to your previous income so that you don't feel the obligation to take the first job that comes along, which can often then set you on a lower path. But the chance of reprogramming the universal credit computers in 3 days, maybe we could have done it because we managed something for furlough, but it wasn't thought to be plausible. From Treasury's point of view, of course, HMRC is a non-ministerial department, but insofar as it answers to any minister, it answers to Treasury ministers. It's in the same physical building. So again, it was easier to work with them than to work with Job Centre Plus, DWP, etc., because they were our team. And again, that sense of silo helps.
Okay, yes, and gentleman there.
Hi there, Mohammed Michelle, Canvas Consulting. You talked about the ability of HMRC to turn something around really quickly and succeed and deliver in a way that probably would have been seen as kind of undeliverable previously. What do you think they've learnt about their ability to get things done well? And have they managed to hold on to any of that? Because what we see is lots of one-hit wonder type things in organizations, departments doing one thing incredibly successfully. COVID was a great example of that happening multiple times, and then seemingly losing the ability to deliver at all. So what did they learn, and what should they have learned?
So I think they ought to learn to be confident. So back in the day, when student loans, the first income contingent student loans were invented, we then had more than one plan. I think we've now got 4 plans, and I think there's a different one in Scotland, and there's the postgraduate loan. Every time one of those comes along, HMRC insists it will break their system. And every single time they manage to deliver it. And I hope it has given them confidence that they can do more things than they can. I hope that it's given them the ability to think about what they can do accurately. But I also wouldn't want to go too far. As I said, I don't think it's reasonable to expect civil servants who are generally paid a market wage for their qualifications. They're neither overpaid nor underpaid. We can argue if they're 5% above or below, but it's roughly, you can't suddenly expect them to start working on Sundays regularly. You can't expect them to suddenly work, 12 hours a day. That would be the wrong lesson to draw. I wouldn't want to draw from this, there's lots of fat and they're useless. What I think we've learned, and this is something I think we learned throughout government, whether it's the vaccine programme, whether it's us in Treasury, whether it's HMRC, whether it's schools getting online schooling up and running, is there's nothing like a crisis to get people's creative juices going. You suddenly realise the world is looking at you and you do stuff. So I'm not saying we should manufacture a crisis, but that sense of never waste a burning platform is, I think, real. The thing I think HMRC could learn from this, not so much from furlough, but from some of the loan schemes, is to think a lot more, going back to your comment about AI, about fraud. So we saw quite a lot of the bounce back loans have not had good outcomes, and what more we could have done ex ante to think about those things. And I think for HMRC, I knew somebody in the world of development who'd been investigated by HMRC 11 years in a row. And he said, why don't we agree just in future, instead of you investigating me every single year we'll flip a coin. He said, because if I know there's a 50-50 chance of being investigated, my incentives are really strong, and we could halve the cost of investigations. You can literally flip the coin in front of me. That's not the most sophisticated form of AI, but, you know, getting away from mechanistic, you trigger these 4 things, so yet again we're going to investigate you. I think there are more intelligent things we can do there. And again, furlough, we were thinking afresh about things rather than just doing what we've always done. Yeah.
Hello, thank you. My name is Barbara Reichwein. I work in social justice and health equity. And what you said about the distinct willingness not to have one size fits all, in my mind, is really exciting and possibly one of the overlooked learnings from the scheme. I was wondering if there's any counterfactual or comparison that could be done between, had you not been as kind and as inclusive and as far-reaching, who would you not have been able to reach with the furlough scheme, and could that be a lesson for other parts of policymaking?
So I think that's a good question. So this is where I get to talk about my favourite subject, which is separating equilibria, which is dividing the population into those that need this help and those that don't. And the great thing about furlough was that any employer who could stay open didn't furlough their staff, because they could stay open and they could make money. If he could, well, actually, we don't make money in Nesta, so it's not a very good example. But let's say we actually sold our stuff. If he could make money by getting me into work, he won't furlough me. So we separated the economy really nicely into 2 halves. Those where there really wasn't work for people to be done, and those where there was. And actually, if anything, I think the danger if we hadn't have done this is we'd have ended up paying money to too many people, and it would have cost even more. Because sometimes what happens is when you need to get to this group, and the only way you can get to this group is to pay this group, you just end up overpaying. And we saw that with rates relief. We gave rates relief to every single company in Britain, because every single shop in Britain, because we had no way of distinguishing those who were open from those who were shut. And wonderfully, Tesco refunded it. They suddenly wrote to us and refunded their rates. And all the other listed supermarkets followed suit. You've got to check this just in case I'm libelous, but my recollection is the Co-op didn't repay the money, Waitrose didn't repay the money, and Iceland didn't repay the money, but Tesco, Sainsbury, Asda and Morrison's did. And they just understood the ethics that sometimes you've got to say, we shouldn't have been a winner here. But it's really hard, and as you say, the danger is that some people lose out, but the other danger is we all lose out as taxpayers by overpaying. And I don't know which way it would have gone in this circumstance.
Can I just pick up on a couple of final questions for me? One is, when I think about the energy price support that was invented in the crisis, I know from talking to people both at Ofgem and at the department, that only got really done because the Treasury stepped in.
Yes.
And there were attempts by others in the department and Ofgem to try and make it work, and it didn't go very far. And then I think the Treasury jumped on it. Is the Treasury in number 10 the only place that can drive things at pace? If so, that seems a dysfunctional system. And so what could we do to actually enable all parts of the state to move quickly? The second one is, not all decisions made in a crisis are good ones. I think Eat Out to Help Out may not have been the best.
I will happily give a separate seminar explaining Eat Out to Help Out and why I think it was a good thing.
Okay.
Yep, I will.
Back to fish and chips, because you did mention fish and chips earlier. So but the point is that I think my question was, you're making a decision in 2 days. You could have messed up, right? HMRC could have been overconfident. It could have been a disaster. Is there a way of doing very, very quick, rigorous work, challenging assumptions to try and improve the rigor of things, even when you're moving at warp speed? So, 2 questions.
So, other departments did do things at speed. So the vaccines was done by DHSC. And DHSC got something close to a blank check. We'd get these things saying, we need another 4 billion or something to buy more PPE from China. And we say, how long do we get? And they're like, 6 minutes. And we can't do this unless you, Treasury, say yes. So we're like, yeah, fine. So technically they came to us. But the number of things that were authorised within an hour for DHSC. And DHSC did some amazing things. The vaccine rollout was very good. But the Nightingale hospitals were not. You know, we built all these hospitals and Captain Tom got to open one that was never used. So they had mistakes, as we did in Treasury, right? The loan schemes didn't all work. So you're dead right. What I think you've got to ask yourself, which we're not always good in government asking yourself, is what changes may have already happened that we don't know about, or may be about to happen that we don't know about, that would make this course of action terrible? And as I said, the good thing about furlough is that it was self-limiting, because as soon as companies could reopen, they would. So if COVID had shot through the population, people had died or lived, and 2 months later it had gone, furlough would have ended naturally, even though we'd said it was 3 months. Whereas for other schemes, the question is, will they keep going when they're not needed, and how easy is it to shut them down? So it was quite hard for DHSE to suddenly announce, we don't need the Nightingales after all. It's kind of a bit embarrassing. We built them and then... So getting over that embarrassment of saying it was a good decision ex ante, but it's not a good decision ex post. The Treasury does have an advantage when it wants to spend money, that nobody checks the Treasury. And that's both a bad thing, because there are just as clever civil servants and ministers in other parts of government, but it's also a good thing, because ultimately the person who has to repair the black hole in government finances is the Chancellor. And there's lots of talk about how Rishi was a skeptic about all sorts of things, and he was. And that's a relief. It's a relief for taxpayers. The last thing you'd want is a Chancellor who just wanted to spend hundreds of billions and say, tomorrow will take care of itself. Robert Choate, who was then head of the OBR, when asked how much this would cost, said, we don't know, but the alternative would be worse. And that was true, or at least ex ante it was plausibly true, but you don't want too many people able to do that. You don't want too many people in education suddenly deciding it would be great if every child in Britain had a laptop, and going out and buying a top-of-the-range laptop for every child in Britain, because they wouldn't have to repair the damage afterwards. So I think the Treasury can and must have a role, because the Treasury is its own, I was going to say worst enemy, that's not quite the right phrase. The Treasury does more internal checks on value for money than any other department, and it starts from a much more sceptical position about spending money. So yeah, it is useful. If it's within the Treasury, it might happen more quickly.
Yeah, I think what I worry about is the usual rat-a-tat-tat between departments and Treasury, where Treasury is institutionally got to be saying, no, this is a bad idea, and it will take time for something to escalate and penetrate through that, unless you've got Rishi going, I'm open for this. So yes, when it's a grade A crisis like COVID was, sure, but I think sort of second order things that are slightly less urgent, I worry that. But
the thing the Treasury will always say to departments, for sure, that is second order urgent. What in your department is the least urgent thing you do? And departments turn around and say, nothing. Yeah. We're like, we don't believe you. There's bound to be something. If you just rank everything from best to worst, we just want that list in order. Yep. Which part of education do you think is least important? Which part of healthcare spending do you think is least important? Which part of prison spending? Which prisoners, if push comes to shove, would you choose to release? Funnily enough, they can answer that when they literally run out of prison spaces, but they'd never answer it if they didn't. And that when departments are willing to rank their spending, they will always get a better hearing from Treasury.
Yep. One more question left, if you've got anything.
Yes.
Great.
Oh, two. I'll answer them really quickly.
Let's do two of them together, and then you can answer them together.
My question, Omar, local government working in decarbonisation. My question is a little bit of a side question. You mentioned that although the UK has a productivity issue, furlough is not necessarily correlated with that. And how often do you get the chance to ask an economist who's worked in government, what's your diagnosis of our productivity
issue? I can do that in 10 seconds.
And is this current government's plan for growth, what's your thoughts on that?
Yep, I'll do that in 20 seconds.
And I just wanted to ask, you had to come up with this policy very, very quickly. What was the kind of toughest decision you had to make in deciding what the policy would be?
So that one is easy. It's how much money? Should it be 50%? Should it be 100%? What should be the cap? The cap was $2,500 a month. At the time, I thought that was going to be 80% of 2,500. So I went to this hour discussion where it turned out a third of us were talking at cross purposes to the other 2/3, because we kept talking about a 2,500 cap, and I thought it was 80% of that, and it turned out that was the maximum payout. So that was the most surreal one afterwards when it was announced, because I thought we decided something different, and so did a third of us in the room. Thankfully, we did what the Chancellor thought we decided, which is all that matters, because he has the democratic mandate. Productivity is partly lack of machinery. The private sector has far too little machinery. That's also true of the NHS. Secondly, management quality. We have far too few people who do MBAs. In general, skills is lower in Britain than in other countries. What will the current government work? We've had a lot of talk. It's getting better, but we now need to see action. So they said, for example, that they will support a third runway at Heathrow. But what does support mean? Does it mean that Heathrow will still have to produce a tower of paper for an environmental assessment that is taller than the control tower, as has happened for the Lower Thames Crossing? Or does it mean that the government will say, you give X million quid to Natural England and they will do compensation, but don't spend a fortune working out exactly which jumping spider happens to live in this area? So the devil will be in the detail.
Tim, thank you very much. I look forward to our next conversation on the lessons from Eat Out to Help Out. But till then, thank you very much, and thank you for great questions and those of you joining.